Seeking change together while striving for individual influence, leaders of the so-called BRICs nations meet in Russia as they sharpen their focus on changing the global financial order. But can consensus outweigh competing interests? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougeda. On the face of it, they are unlikely partners, the so-called BRICs nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and more recently, South Africa. Still considered to be emerging economies, but increasingly challenging Western dominance of world financial institutions. And while BRICs may have been the acronym of choice, it by no means reflects the economic order of the group members, nor their individual influence. Russia is hosting the 7th BRICS summit starting on Wednesday in the remote western city of Ufa, and it's looking to send out a message of strength and unity. Well, the group will also launch a much-anticipated development bank, as Al Jazeera's Emma Hayward in Moscow tells us.
Well, this summit will take place in the city of Ufa, which is more than 1,100 kilometres away from Moscow. It will involve the leaders of the BRICS nations, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Together they represent about 40% of the world's population and just over 20% of the global economic output. Now, one of the main thrusts of this summit is the launch of this new BRICS Development Bank. It will have a huge currency reserve. It will invest in infrastructure projects in those BRICS nations and also in other emerging markets. One of the main aims of it, though, is to try to reshape the Western dominance of the world's financial institutions. Now, this is taking place in Russia, and of course, Vladimir Putin has looked isolated of late on the international stage. Here, though, he will very much take centre stage at BRICS. This is Emma Hayward for Inside Story in Moscow.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our guests from Moscow, Vladimir Mikhaev. He's the co-author of the weekly Russian analytical program Troika Report. In London, we have Andrew Leung. He's an independent China analyst. Joining us from Nairobi is Ali Khan Sachu, CEO of Rich Management and a specialist on emerging economies. Thanks very much for being with us on Inside Story. Gentlemen, before we start, let me just take a look at the BRICS group in a little more detail with you. The acronym, which was just BRIC to start with, was first coined by a Goldman Sachs analyst in 2001 who forecast that Brazil, Russia, India and China would be the world's wealthiest economies by 2050. Well, the foreign ministers of those countries did then get together. They held their first summit in 2009. South Africa was invited to join in December the following year, with BRIC becoming BRICS. Now, critics are arguing that divisions and economic disparities undermine the bloc's unity. But leaders maintain the group promotes stability in the global economic system as well as in developing nations.
The momentum of cooperation between BRICS countries continues to rise, and common interests are expanding. The foundation for cooperation is enlarging, and communication and coordination has been strengthened. The BRICS countries have become the major force driving world economic growth, improving global economic governance, and promoting the democratization of international relations.
Ali Khan Sachu in Nairobi, do these countries have enough in common now in today's world in 2015 to sustain the shared institution?
You know, I think the salad days, the Hallison days for BRICS was all about that decade from 2001. Those were the great days, the exponential expansion of all these economies. But if you look at it right now, each of those countries, with India probably the exception, has significant challenges. You take Brazil, where you know the economy is crawling now; it's barely above zero. Take Russia, where another leg lower in the crude oil price is going to put enormous and unbearable pressure, financial pressure on Russia. China, where you've got a stock market out of control, more stockholders than Communist Party members, lots of pressure building. So I think, you know, if you talk about BRICS, the salad days were a few years ago, lots of challenges right now, not sure that they can pull it together at this moment in time in such a fragmented, volatile and world that we live in.
Andrew Leung, can they pull it together with these challenges that Ali Khan Sachu was just highlighting? And also, you do admit that there is structural disparity between China and the rest of the BRICS members. Chinese economy, for one, being much larger, actually larger than all of the BRICS economies combined. So is it a concern that China already benefits more from the trade dynamics?
Well, of course, as you rightly pointed out, there is this disparity in terms of the size of the economy. China is bigger than the rest of the BRICS combined. But on the other hand, there are common interests amongst the BRICS countries. For example, you would look at the international financial order since the end of the Second World War. That has been dominated by Western kind of led financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and also the Asian Development Bank. Much of the developing emerging world has rarely any kind of say in these institutions. And so as the BRICS countries are becoming greater in size, even though slower in growth rates in recent years, still, if you look at not only the BRICS, but combined with the rest of the emerging economies in the world, they, in aggregate terms, they already exceed the entire Western world economies, about slightly over half of it. And then the growth rates, if we talk about the growth rates, the average growth rates over the past 10 years or let alone 20 years, the emerging market has been the growth engine in the world. But then, of course, in recent years, the emerging markets are slowing down, the BRICS together, and China included. But of course, the West is not entirely immune from this slowing down because of demographics. So you look at what's happening in Europe, for example.
Right. Vladimir, that point, let me put it to you, because the fact is these economies are slowing down. So can this economic slowdown turn into something perhaps more damaging that would affect this concept of BRICS?
Well, I don't believe that there are any, let's say, emerging markets or any other market which could claim a sustainable growth at the moment. I believe that such a thing as growth rate is as volatile as the price of oil. So in case, definitely all the 5 countries of BRICS grouping, they face challenges common and very specific to their own markets, but definitely they only have to gain from cooperation between them. And after all, it's once again, it's united we stand. And if we just part away, then we'll be an easy prey, let's say, to the destructive forces of the invisible hand of the market. Some analysts here, Russia, say that it's much better to be part of a large grouping and where we have a certain consensus on major issues from in investment, trade, in macroeconomics in general, than to go it alone.
Well, the U.S. used to far outstrip the BRICS nations' economic output, and in 2007, the U.S. economy was roughly double that of the BRICS. But if you take a look at their combined gross domestic product last year, it almost matched the U.S., and that has led mainly by the rapid growth of the Chinese and Indian economies. Brazil, the second biggest economy in the bloc, but India making strong gains, and it's in fact now pushed past Russia. Vladimir, speaking of Russia, though, how developed are ties between China and Moscow at this point? Are they as developed as they should be ahead of the launch of the BRICS Bank, specifically the National Development Bank?
Absolutely. I think that Russia will certainly capitalize on access to this large pool of syndicated loans, which this bank actually presents. As for the perspective of the cooperation of the countries, I think that one of the major issues which is now being discussed is trying to link the Russia-led project, which is called the Eurasian Economic Union, comprised of Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, and the grand vision and concept of China of the Silk Road economic belt, something that will implies the creation of a formal infrastructure that will link China as the manufacturing superpower today with its markets both in Central Asia, in Russia, and further on to Europe. I think there is a great growth potential in this link-up, and if you take it in a wider context of BRICS, I think a lot of countries are going to gain from that.
Andrew, you know as well as we all do here that you can't talk about economic uncertainty without talking about political uncertainty. And then when it comes to the case of Russia specifically, there is a possible economic fallout from the conflict in Ukraine. How could that influence the BRICS ideals going forward?
No, I think that as far as geopolitics are concerned, of course, all the BRIC countries like to exert their own individual influence in the world, and they see areas of cooperation. But in terms of international the kind of the rules. Of course, they all want to play by international rules, but of course, Ukraine is an exception, because if we look at Ukraine, it's based on a referendum, and most of the people in Ukraine, they were of Russian origin.
But what's happened in Ukraine, Andrew, is that certain countries have now imposed sanctions on Russia. So. Along with that comes anxiety from investors. So how is that going to affect Russia's position within BRICS and its strength economically as well as politically?
Well, I think the sanctions on Russia over Ukraine are likely to strengthen the areas of cooperation between Russia and China. Now, the first point I'd like to make, coming back to the point made by my colleague, is that in spite of the cooperation of the BRICS, amongst the BRICS, they are not forming a separate bloc away from the global economy. They're very much embedded in the global economy after the joining of the World Trade Organization. Of course, if you look at the trade, every country is becoming interdependent and interconnected. But having said that, though, they want to exert their influence, and then the sanction on Russia, as I was saying, is going to strengthen the cooperation between Russia and China, because you look at Russia, the most important commodity is oil and gas and energy, and which country is the biggest customer in the world? And of course, this is China. But of course, China wants to use Russia to balance the kind of American pivot to Asia, which is China containment policy in all but name. So there is likely to be an increasing area of cooperation, but they are not going to become all-weather friends, though, because there is still a degree of rivalry and suspicion. For example, Russia is worried about its Russian Far East and the Chinese settlements in eastern Siberia. But they are likely to set aside these worries, because these are long-term worries. The immediate concern is how to balance the world economy and also how to create cooperation amongst the BRICS.
Ali Khan, can they set aside these differences going forward? And also, just to pick up on something that Andrew Leung was saying, is that there is this opinion that the BRICS Development Bank, as well as the other institutions that come along with it, would serve to counterbalance other global powerhouses like the IMF and the World Bank, for example. Do you agree that that is the direction BRICS wants to go in?
So just to take that two-sided question, the first thing is, I think, you know, the twin pivot to Kiev that the Obama administration put into play pushed Vladimir Putin into Xi Jinping's embrace. That was a cause and effect that could be seen as clear and is as clear as day. Sanctioning Russia has forced Vladimir Putin to look elsewhere for more support, and I think that's why this event is so important for him particularly. In terms of BRICS, clearly they are chafing at the bit. They've been trying to reorder the financial architecture, get a bigger vote in it, and they've been blocked at every turn. So this is an attempt to break out of that straitjacket, that post-Bretton Woods straitjacket that really has ordered the world in favor, I would say, of Europe and North America. However, I think there are significant challenges. If you look at the loan books, if you look at the financial systems, take China, for example. I mean, any bad credit in the world has been able to borrow big from China. If you consider the quality of that lending book, you would not really be that impressed. You look at situations in Brazil. I mean, we've seen scandal after scandal. So I'm concerned that this is definitely, there's political impetus behind this, but I'm not sure that there is the right economic thinking and in order to challenge the old Bretton Woods institutions. I think this is more a political decision than necessarily a sensible economic one, and I think there are risks attached to the execution.
What do you mean when you say you're not sure the right economic thinking is behind it? We know that they're launching this National Development Bank. We've been talking about it. Ali Khan, also, they've created a $100 billion contingency reserve arrangement. We understand that's meant to provide liquidity protection to member countries. So what is missing that you need to see?
Well, I think, a few decades of policy making, of execution, that experience that these institutions that exist have at the World Bank and the IMF. And I think if you look at most of these economies, we're talking about economies which are not necessarily, with the exception of Brazil and South Africa, entirely democratic. I think decision-making is very top-down. I would call Xi Jinping's administration, I heard this beautiful phrase, neo-totalitarian. And I think in situations like that, where neo-totalitarian regimes are looking to sort of get into this a lending business, there are serious challenges. And I think we can see that already when we look back and say to ourselves, where have a lot of these guys lent to? I think if you're well connected to Vladimir, you've got a good chance of getting a very big loan. Similarly with Xi Jinping, I'm not so sure that the credit side of it will be done as effectively as other global institutions are doing at the moment.
Vladimir, your take on what Ali Khan is saying, and specifically about Russia's position, and also what do you think about this BRICS Bank? Can it be a real challenge to the World Bank and the IMF, or is there no competition there?
I think yes. I think I would agree that it is, in the long term, it will be certainly not just a competition, it will present a slightly different model of arranging and managing the world finances. What I mean is, we all know that, for instance, the IMF loans have certain strings attached, and many of them are really politically loaded. That's for certain. In this case, we believe that the pooling financial resources within the BRICS financial institutions will create a certain new kind of level playing field with no politics meddling with the economics. Well, as we know, for instance, Russia is not afraid, for instance, that any of the other 4 countries of the BRICS alliance will precondition Russia's access to loans with any political demands. This is something that we don't expect, for instance, that any of these countries might use, for instance, the American-based and American-registered credit rating agencies, and also access to loans and money in general, as a political weapon against Moscow. We don't expect that. So in general, I think there is a potential for BRICS to evolve into an alliance which will suggest a new model of global finances, which will be more equitable and more fair, and that could be used not only by these 2 countries, but more generally by other emerging markets, for instance.
Andrew Leung, your take on the bank specifically, and whether it'll pose a challenge to the World Bank and the IMF, and why do you think, what exactly the purpose of this new development bank is?
I think there are 2 main features of the new development bank that are very different from the Washington Consensus and the Bretton Woods institutions dominated kind of financial infrastructure. The first one is that you can see the power is more evenly distributed. For example, Russia and India and Brazil, they are all invited to share various leading roles, either as president or as chairman of the board of directors, and so on. And no one would have a vetoing power, unlike the IMF. the vetoing power is vested in the United States. Secondly, I think that the new development bank is also focused on building up some sort of cushion against a possible impact in the world financial infrastructure because of the huge deleveraging that's likely to take place in the not distant future. Is going to cause a lot of repercussions amongst the developing countries. And so you can see that the new development bank is really a much more equitable kind of structure that can be taken advantage of, as my colleague was saying, not only by the BRICs members, but also the rest of the development world.
Ali Khan, how do you see this evolving? Do you see other emerging countries joining these 5 BRICs members?
Absolutely. I think, success will always bring more partners on board. And I think once people, and particularly in the developing world, see the capacity of the bank to help out, I think we'll see more people jump on board. So very confident about that. But I think what I would like to see come out of this meeting in Russia is more situational awareness of the incredible turbulence these markets are undergoing. Like to see some swap lines being put in place. So if one of these countries comes under significant currency pressure, which I expect to happen, particularly in Russia, that there are sort of firewalls and safety nets amongst these countries. I think that will be key, given the situation that they're currently facing.
Vladimir, is that what you'll be looking for to come out of the meeting as well, or something else?
I'm looking for a roadmap on the development of the lines for the next 10 years until 2025. At least that's what the officials have been saying. They have been trying to map out such a document. And in this document, I believe the most important element will be trying to marriage the Russian concept, or the Russian alliance, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the grand vision of Xi Jinping of one belt, one road. That means linking the countries in Eastern Asia, Central Asia, Russia, in order creating a powerful infrastructure to facilitate the free flow of goods, investment, and probably and people, and all this space linking Europe and Asia.
What will you be looking for, Andrew, to come out of UFA?
I agree with my colleague that the One Belt, One Road and Russia's Eurasian Union would feature prominently there. But in addition to that, I think that referring to the remark that authoritarian kind of regimes won't be able to create a kind of financial infrastructure, I tend to disagree with that somewhat, because if you look at the largest wealth fund, I mean, they're run by countries in the Middle East, and they are not exactly democratic countries, and of course even Singapore, according to some academics, is not a full economy, full democracy. So I think that there is a great role for the BRICS countries to play, but I think that they're also entirely shut out from the Western-dominated, rule-based financial infrastructure either. I think there is a great deal for them to learn from the institutions built up in the World Bank and the IMF, but of course creating their own bank would strengthen their influence in the world, especially amongst developing countries who are very hungry for infrastructural investments.
Ali Khan, you can come in now and respond to the comment that was made by Andrew, because he was referring to something that you had said.
Well, all I would say is that tons of money around the world, loads of sovereign wealth funds, and they don't necessarily perform that well. I can give you a whole host of them. The quantum might be there, but if you go and look at the performance, the performance is not necessarily there. So I'm not convinced. I think the more transparency you have, the more democracy, the more you democratize finance, the better performance you're going to get. And I think particularly in some of these countries where there is a lack of transparency, where there is tremendous power at the apex of the system, that in such a situation it's going to be extremely tricky to make sure that these very strong global values seep through the system. I wish the bank the best, because I think it will uplift the developing world, and Africa in particular, where China in particular has played a very big role. But, you know, I'm highly skeptical, and I think we're in circumstances where countries have got to look to their own situations at this moment in time. And once we get beyond the fact that Vladimir Putin will have a tremendous success and show that he has not been sanctioned and sectioned off and he's still a world player, that people will have to look at domestic situations which in some cases have the potential to spiral out of control.
From Moscow, Vladimir Mikhayev, Andrew Leung in London, and Ali Khan Satu in Nairobi, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Well, thank you for watching the program. As always, we welcome your thoughts. You can get in touch via our program page on aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can even tweet us using @AJ Inside Story. From myself, the whole team in Doha, bye-bye for now.